Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And I spent a bit of time making that promo, that intro there, because I wanted to do a jazzier one. And we are talking about the push into Germany over the next few days. And in fact, going into April after my break in Guernsey, we'll be pushing on and talking about those last few weeks of World War II. Anyway, Dr. Curatola joins us once again to expand on his previous show about his new book, Armies Afloat, and talk about Operation Flashpoint and the US Army, Ninth Army, that is, crossing of the Lower Rhine 80 years ago this week. So I'll bring him in now. It's morning over there. Good morning, John. How are you today?
I'm doing well, Paul, and yourself?
I'm good. So the theme we've been talking about with other historians is just how Remagen aside, which has a little bit of fame because of the movie and things like that, we as history enthusiasts seem to just lose interest after kind of the end of the Ardennes and end of maybe Veritable for Canadians, and there's just this sort of feeling that you're sliding down a slippery, easy run into VE-Day now. And so the last chapter as well, before we get into the presentation, why don't we talk about it as much? Because a hell of a lot of really cool stuff happens.
Yeah. I think a lot of it is, people, they look at historically, they smell the barn, to use that term in the United States. It's March, it's April, and this war is coming to an end. So, there's nothing interesting now to really talk about. And to your point, here in the U.S., what you see a lot of is after D-Day, it's kind of a wash. Yeah, there's this thing called the bulge, and then next thing you know, it's May 8th. So I agree with you. You have these kind of touchstone moments, D-Day and the bulge, and after that, I agree with you. People just kind of lose interest because it's a fait accompli in their minds. And of course, as you well know, at the time, no, it's not.
Yeah.
This is, the Germans, are still fighting. And as you know, I come up against any German town, it's a 50-50 chance whether or not I'm fighting through it or it's going to be peaceful,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that uncertainty. I mean, we talked the last weekend about the 7th Division pushing towards Saarbrücken and going through Alsace, and intelligence being able to really give no picture about it. So are the French Germans going to resist? Are they going to welcome us without? No, well, we don't know. And there's a certain amount of that as you go into Germany. Are we going to be welcomed as conquerors, liberators? I mean, it depends where you are and what you're doing. But anyway, we're going to get on with the presentation. So I'll fire up your PowerPoint. There we go. So folks, I'm going to hand over to John for this, but this is a really, really interesting, and we talked about last culmination of a lot of skills that the U.S. Army have been building over the previous years. So over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I appreciate the opportunity, Paul, to talk about this. And the reason why I got interested in Flashpoint, and this goes back to our discussion last week, was as I was looking at how the Army is developing amphibious capability in the ETO, working with our Air Force and Navy brethren, because all amphibious assaults are joint. Inherently joint. I looked at the Rhine crossing, and I didn't know this. I learned that there's a whole Navy contingent there, and we're going to talk about that, and the fact that this is an amphibious assault just like any other amphibious assault that I talked about last week. And it's really kind of the exclamation point at the end of the sentence, if you ask me, in terms of joint operations, in a amphibious environment. And the Army, we would call these things wet gap crossings, is the official Army term for these things. But the fact that you're using coordinated efforts much along the same lines as an amphibious assault really kind of piqued my interest, which is why, in fact, and shameless self-promotion, which is why I use this as my concluding chapter in my book to talk about this is kind of a crescendo event of how the services are all learning how to work together and to be creative.
Yeah, absolutely.
So again, just to kind of set the frame, I know you've been talking about the drive into Germany proper, and as early as October of 44, they're looking at, hey, how are we going to cross this big obstacle called the Rhine River? And they're already starting to do engineering surveys and trying to determine, soil composition and water, river flows and those kinds of boring engineering and geological studies that engineers have to know in order to do these kinds of crossings. So you're already seeing studies being done in the fall of 1944 in preparation, and it kind of speaks to how technically difficult these operations are. And I've read through some of the plans, and yeah, they'll put you to sleep. And I was going to put some of the relief maps up, but they're so complex and full of terrain features and symbols that it wouldn't even come across very well on a screen. You can see this one here of the 12th Army map here is even as difficult, and it's much the basic trace of the front lines here in February 45. Again, in keeping with your theme, Paul, as we know, the British Second Army and the American Ninth were all pushing here towards the Rhine itself, with Ninth Army pushing up towards Dusseldorf and Wesel, First Army pushing straight towards Cologne and Bonn and Remagen. And so we're seeing this approach of the Rhine River itself. And of course, the subsequent operations of Veritable and Grenade that get us to the Rhine River itself. So those are kind of the building blocks that we've been talking about for a while here to get us to the river. Now, 12th Army Group has multiple crossings. It isn't just one. You can see on this map, there's the 9th in the north, the 1st in the middle, and 3rd Army in the south. And this is also indicative of the wider frontage that Eisenhower is pursuing in the war, as opposed to Monty with his rapier thrust. And I'm sure your audience knows about the difference in terms of vision of those two leaders. But this is indicative of Eisenhower winning that argument and subsequently pushing on a larger front to put as much pressure on the Germans as possible. So the First Army will get there to Remagen, and we know it's still intact. They'll leverage it as much as they can before it actually it collapses. And they'll get some floating bridges across the span to start building that bridgehead. But again, it's not enough to get an army group across the Rhine. Okay. 3rd Army is going to go push in down by Bingen and Oppenheim, with 2 more by Ober and Landstein. And the 3rd Army is going to be in the north between Wesel and Orosoi. And they're going to be working with the British that are going to be to the north or on their left flank. So it's not just one bridging, it is a number of bridging efforts. And here's something you have to consider. If you're doing all these bridging operations simultaneously in the U.S. Army, and the Brits are doing theirs as well, as we know, you only have X amount of bridging assets, so you can't rob Peter to pay Paul. So what that requires you to have sufficient amount of Bailey bridges and boats and engineering support and graders and gravel and all those things that come part and parcel. You can't just make one unit the primary effort. They all have to have that in equipment in their organizations themselves. So think about a construction site, that you're going to have to spread across the entire Rhine frontage for each one of these armies trying to move across the river. That's a lot of gear. That's a lot of gear. And as I mentioned, last week, when you start talking about the operational and strategic levels of war, it's all about throughput. How much stuff can I get down a road or across a bridge? And of course, Europe's war-torn at this time, and some bridges have been blown up for obvious reasons. So the Germans have spiked them. The road network may be bombed out by the Army Air Corps as part of a battlefield air interdiction. And you have to move this stuff on the limited roads available, and everybody's using them. So think about traffic management. How do I get my stuff from my unit while another unit is also using the same road at the same time? And so you get these kind of unsexy arguments about who has priority of lift and who has priority of the roads and the priority of the gear. And again, we can go into this. It's boring, but it's very essential organizational detail that's required for such a large endeavor. Let's talk about the obstacle itself. Talk about the Rhine River, basically from the Swiss Alps to the North Sea, from Basel to the Netherlands, about 320 miles. And in the valley is about 20 to 30 miles wide, depending upon, where you're measuring it. The average width, about, almost 1,000-foot wide river, sometimes up to 2,000. And it's amazing, along this entire river, there's no fording sites that you can just drive your tank or your vehicle in there to get to the other side. And what's more important is what I have here under the velocities here, and they're in red for a reason. 8 to 12 feet per second, or about 5 miles an hour. And it's too fast for most of your Army engineering assets to deal with that tidal force. And so what that requires is some help from the United States Navy. And we'll get to that here in a little bit.
Just a quick question. Ian asked about the relative size of the Ninth Army compared to First and Third Armies. Are they all about the same at this point?
No, the Ninth Army is really too small. It's got 3 corps with about 2 divisions per corps. It's of course attached to the Brits. And the Americans and Bradley's none too happy about the fact that Ninth Army is basically opconned to the Brits, but it's seen as kind of one of those political sops between the Americans and the Brits. Hey, we're going to help you out. The Brits are suffering in manpower, as is everybody, but we're going to give you an army to help fully flush out 21st Army Group. And so what you see is that the Ninth Army is one of the smaller ones, but it's still there to help flush out the Brits.
Thanks.
Going back to the river obstacle, little concealment on the banks is basically a flat plain. So for the enemy, that's excellent fields of fire, excellent observation. And of course, they expect the Germans to blow all the spans. And of course, they do. Remagen, the last one, actually being fell. So the Ninth Army mission here is to cross the Rhine north of the Ruhr Valley, construct 3 tactical bridges, a ferry, and a semi-permanent fixed bridge. And on 4 March, 16th Corps, John Anderson is tasked with the following requirements: assault across the river, secure a bridgehead, expand the bridgehead rapidly, hold the defensive line, maintain contact with the UK on your left flank, and seize the Lippe and Lippe-Senten Canal bridges. And so what you have here is multiple operations happening at the same time within the various zones in the 16th Corps area. At the same time, there's also supposed to, once they get across, is prevent the German artillery from ranging Wesel and the British forces as they come across north of them. And so what this lays out is a multiple corps operation. And let's take a look at what's going on here. So Ninth Army has 3 corps abreast the Rhine, but what they're going to do is 16th Corps is going to establish the bridgeheads between Orsor and Wesel. And you can see I've circled, because it's kind of hard to see these maps. To the north, there's Wesel, and here's Orsor down here. And this is the Ninth Army's operational area. And what's going to happen is 16th Corps will establish those bridgeheads, and then 19th and 13th Corps will pass through the 16 area corps and head into Munster and in Hanover. So you think about this classic passage of lines, but they're doing it across a wet gap crossing, which is a significant tactical effort to do this, both a passages line and doing it over bridges. So the intent here, the larger picture, to kind of zoom out a little bit, is Ninth Army is going to head towards the Ruhr Valley in that northern part as part of the American effort to secure the industrial heartland of Germany. And this is the American effort on that northernmost pincher movement, while the First and the Third Armies are going to head into the guts of the Ruhr Valley and secure that. And of course, the idea here for Eisenhower is if I take the Ruhr Valley, it will preclude Germany from, supporting a war effort and manufacturing arms and goods and those kinds of things. So let's take a look here for, here we go. I'm sorry. Yeah, here's your corps crossing. Now, if you notice, there's 3 basic locations I'd like to point out to you. There's Wallach, Merum, and Milchplatz. Those are the 3 locations you're going to see the major bridging operations occur. Also, I've highlighted there in yellow the boundaries between the 2nd British Army and the 9th U.S. Army to kind of show you the boundary lines that are existing. These kind of boundaries are important because who owns that battle space? This way, you're not shooting blue on blue. I'm not shooting on a British unit. They're not shooting on me. You have to have clearance to cross those boundaries. It's basically traffic management for a firefight. And so it's important to understand where these boundaries exist to prevent fratricide and to manage traffic flow. If you look down to the south, I've also highlighted the division boundaries between the 30th and the 79th divisions, which will be most of my focus today because they are part of 16th Corps. So I'm going to focus on those two right there. I've put in the red boxes where you see the major bridges that are going to be established. There's a treadway bridge to the north. There's a pontoon bridge just south of it near Wallash. And then in Miram, there's an M1 treadway bridge. And by Milchplatz, there's an M2 treadway bridge. And so, I've kind of let the cat out of the bag and showed you, what these sites are going to look like. But that's the basic plan. I'd also like to point out to you, look at the names of these crossing sites: Red Beach, White Beach, Blue Beach. It's the same thing you use in amphibious assault. You designate them by color because it's relatively simple, and you can help designate them at night with lanterns and those kinds of things. And so, again, you're seeing some of these same ideas, regarding amphibious assault that you saw, say, at Normandy or at southern France or any other operation.
Just a quick question about the fact it is essentially an amphibious landing. What is the balance with regards risk and reward when we get to crossing the Rhine? Because we all talk about the importance of, going back to Husky, going back to Overlord. I mean, they absolutely had to be done. There's still a sense of the outcome of the war is uncertain. We've got to take risks. I mean, that Husky is, and well, I guess, and Avalanche as well. They're pretty risky. But with this, March, the war is, as we said at the beginning, the war is going to end one way now. So no one wants to be doing anything foolhardy. So is there anything in the kind of archives you looked at about this, about balancing it? Obviously, you want to bring all these assets that you talk about into play. There's no point in getting across with just a few infantry. There's echoes of river crossings in Italy haunting everybody in that regard. So is there anything about how they're treating this? Obviously, the Rhine has got to be crossed. There's no not doing it, but that kind of risk aspect.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that the Americans have going, the Brits, and I said the Americans, I should say the Allies, and I apologize, is by this time we have a pretty good feeling that the Wehrmacht's on its heels. Doesn't mean it's not dangerous. Doesn't mean that it can't inflict casualties, but we do know that they've been reduced. And matter of fact, in the approach up to the Rhine, Simpson's convinced that the Wehrmacht's in disarray. In that, while there might be sporadic artillery or a lone Luftwaffe fighter, coming over, or a jet bomber, a 234 coming over and bombing a bridge, as we well know. But what we're seeing here is that in terms of risk management, this ain't your daddy's Wehrmacht anymore, to kind of use that term. And so it's not quite what it used to be. But again, doesn't mean it's not dangerous and can't inflict some pain on you. Yeah. But that risk that, say, we incurred, say, in Husky or in Salerno or even Normandy, that's been reduced to a certain extent. So there's that portion of it. But again, this is a hard operation, even if you're not under enemy fire. Even if you're not under enemy observation, to do this in a tactical environment is difficult. And so that's kind of adds, to the complexity of this operation. Does that answer the question, Paul?
Yep. Thank you very much. Perfect.
Yeah. So let's take a look at what we call, is, again, I mentioned a wet gap crossing here. And again, much like an amphibious assault, you have to establish a bridgehead. And how do you do that? What you do is you're going to send infantry across in some assault boats in concert with some supporting fires. Later waves will pass through and take the high ground and establish what we talked about last week, a forced beachhead line. And what you're going to have as well is aerial support. The Army Air Corps is going to get involved and do some battlefield air interdiction. The RAF and the U.S. Army Air Corps are going to hit, bridges and road networks in the Ruhr Valley to help prevent German troop movements and command and control. So you also saw that in an amphibious assault, this idea of establishing a beachhead and then having the communications and logistics to push through, move supplies and men, material ashore, and organize that far shore for subsequent operations. And so again, this just smacks of the same doctrine that we talked about last week in FM 31 TAC 5. It's just that it's a river as opposed to open ocean or water. So while you're in this combat environment, you also have to start building bridges and constructing ferry sites. And one of the things that's difficult here is you're doing deliberate engineering, unlike combat engineering where you're blowing things up, and trying to make defensive positions. Here, you're building bridges to actually facilitate transportation in a combat environment. So what does that require? This requires you to have some assault boats, ferries, Bailey bridges, and some floating bridges. And we'll talk a little bit about this here. And you can see the pictures here. You see the guys in an assault boat. They're all rowing themselves ashore. And you can imagine if you're trying to row across the Rhine and you're in that thing, you've got to feel pretty vulnerable in that initial wave as you go ashore. And then here you see, a Bailey bridge, used as a ferry trying to move men and equipment across the Rhine itself. And so here's some of those. Here's just a further explanation of what you see here. Here's the assault boats that we were talking about, and you also have a smaller reconnaissance boat. So you have you put like 12 men in this thing, and they row themselves across. They're going to establish that initial force beachhead line, and then what's going to happen is the subsequent waves will come in. They're going to expand that beachhead, and then what they're going to do is they're going to allow the follow-on waves to push through, get to the high ground. They're going to expand this out. By the same token, they're going to establish an area where you can bring ferries across and say, bring your armor or your artillery or your supplies or vehicles or whatever you need. And you can see here's what you have in these kind of standard ferries that they're going to produce. And you can drive a vehicle on them and they just kind of float it across. Many of these are powered, of course. They don't move very fast. But again, one of the problems you have here at the Rhine River is the fact that it moves relatively quickly as rivers go. Here's your Bailey Bridge, which is a British innovation, and it's really, really a marvel of engineering feat. It includes prefabricated truss panels that are joined by pegs that are further strengthened by traversing beams. It doesn't require really a lot of special tools or equipment. It can be put together relatively quickly. It's made out of wood and steel, and it can be carried on trucks to move it into the battlefield itself. And you can see here, sections of it are small enough that it can be moved by manpower. You can see there is a team of soldiers that are actually moving these things. And so they can be quickly employed, to span a ditch or a waterway, or some kind of a gap. And they're modular in design, so you can add on to these things and expand them. And they're also strong enough, these bridges, they can handle a tank. And as you can see in the one picture there's a Sherman sitting on there. It's about 40 tons sitting on some barges. So you see, great utility with these Bailey bridges to help provide that initial movement across for some of your combat power. Now, as I mentioned, this is going to require some help from the U.S. Navy. And here you have, and for the 9th Army specifically, Navy Task Unit 122.5.3. Why the Navy does that, I don't know why they put those titles on. They're kind of goofy, but that's what the Navy does. Okay. So at any rate, they're going to support a 9th Army. And again, you see I have in red that 8 to 12 feet per second current is too much for standard bridges and ferries. And so what you're going to have is the Navy is going to be required to help with the movement of troops and equipment once that bridgehead is established, and to help build those bridges. And so in this particular task unit, you're going to have 24 LCVPs and 24 LCMs. Why the LCMs? Because the LCVPs can't move tanks, but the LCMs can, because of the 40-ton requirement on that. You're also going to see some Navy lighterage and some barges out there. They're going to bring some anti-mine nets that the Brits bequeathed to us. And you're going to have about 300 seamen, i.e. CBs, construction battalion guys. Again, used to seeing these guys on beaches building up, supply depots and receiving supplies coming in. Here, we're going to need them to help create those beachheads across the river itself. Now, here's what's interesting. They come from the UK on 4 November, and they arrive in Le Havre, and then they're sent to Maastricht as part of the 9th Army. And here's what's interesting. You see that they're taking their LCVPs and putting them on 40-foot trailers. These are, most of you are familiar with those dragon wagons. They're usually used to haul armor around, for recovery when a vehicle gets stuck. But they're going to put them on the back of the LCVPs in the back of these trucks. and they're going to set them in the St. Peter Canal there in the UK or in Holland, and they're getting ready for this wet gap crossing. In 8 January, you're going to have 24 LCMs that are going to arrive via the Albert Canal, but the Albert Canal still only goes so far. These are still going to have to be trucked in. At the same time, they're going to establish take an Army Engineer Combat Group. And they got to test these things. Can you use them, in a canal? What's going to be the challenges of using these in something we've never tried before? And can we use these to move pontoon trailers? Can we use these things to move tank transporters? This is all innovation that's occurring from the bottom up and not from the top down.
And just worth reminding, can you put on that back on that photo for a second,
Sure, please.
John? Is that reminder when James Holland and Al Murray talk about it quite often is the Allies by this point in the war, well, from early in the war, they absolutely have to have a firm grasp on the transportation lines through Europe, both trucks and railway, because moving that kind of stuff, those transporters, there's villages in Normandy that couldn't take that. There's villages going to be in Belgium that couldn't take that stuff going through. So, where the Germans can still kind of pull out of the hat a sort of a counterattack by, a few Panthers appearing out of a sort of a logging track in the middle of nowhere, the Allies have to have really good, solid roads because of the size and the enormity of their army. And it's just worth reminding that these are some of the, they're good problems to have. The Germans would cut their right arm off to have the kind of assets that the Americans and Brits and Canadians have, but it requires a lot of logistical planning.
Yeah. And other people, and to your point, Paul, the realization that the tooth to tail is, people would say it's disproportionate, but that's the price you pay to have a modern mechanized army and capabilities. It requires a robust road network, transportation network, stevedores, cranes, engineers, that's what's required nowadays. It's the same thing, say, with, aviation. The pilot and the airplane are the most visible part of air power, but talking about the fuel farms, the hangars, the runways, the parking aprons, all those things that come part and parcel with modern mechanized militaries. And it's not sexy, it's not fun, but that adage that professionals talk logistics, and that's really what, as you mentioned, James is getting at here, is that the ability to power project inland, with a robust transportation network and assets is a requirement.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you.
Yep. And see, there's a LCVP being taken off of one of those transporters and being moved over into the Rhine. I found a number of these. Here's your LCM on an M25. And one of the problems that they had with the LCMs, you can see, where the coxswain sits there in that little armored box. Well, it sat a little bit high on some of the road clearances. And so in a number of instances, they had to cut those off and then repair them once they got to their destination, because there might have been a low bridge or something like that that was in the way between point A and point B. And here's some more of them going through these small towns. You can see there's a little convoy here. There's 2 or 3 of them if you look in the background here. And this is a significant movement of assets across the country. And here's an LCM being actually put in the water. Now, this is also problematic. If you don't have a crane, how do you get this boat into the water if there's not a ramp? Or it's relatively shallow and marshy. These are some of the problems they're going to have to solve, and they're going to find out later on. I'll tip my hand. Getting the LCMs in the Rhine is a problem because they're big, they're ungainly, and of course some rivers edges are unprepared, and so trying to get the LCMs in there is problematic. You can see here you do have a crane, but it's still you got a straight edge there that the boat's scraping on.
Yeah, straight edge, firm surface for the crane to sit on. We all know there's bits of the floodplains near the Rhine where, even a human standing there would sink in. So that photo there sort of test run conditions there, show it was going to get a lot harder than that. As we're forewarning.
And to your point, they're going to have to train to that. You just don't show up and do it. So thanks for that introduction. I'll get to that here in a second. And on top of that, you just don't have the Mike boats. You also have ducks, and ducks are, the more I've studied this, in every front, whether the Pacific or the European theater, ducks always get a rave review. Everybody loves these things. You know, they're reliable. You can move artillery, men, supply, everything. And so we're going to use a large number of these ducks. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't realize that there were LVTs in the European theater until I was doing the research for this book. And lo and behold, so it's not just the Marine Corps using these things in the Pacific. Everybody kind of identifies them with the Corps, but the Army's using them here for this cross river operation. On top of that, the M29, the Weasels, the smaller ones, and they're going to bring in these things called sea mules. You can see there in the lower left-hand corner. These are basically little tugboats you can put in the river, and they can push barges around, you know, in some of the lighter rigs to get stuff from the near shore to the far shore. Now, Paul, as you mentioned, you just don't show up and do this stuff. You have to learn how to work with this equipment, and a lot of these soldiers, you know, are just aren't used to it. And so they're going to have to figure out, how can you launch these things? What about the river currents? What can I handle? What can I handle? Boom and cable, the propulsion for these Bailey bridges. How do I get them from point A to point B? That, as you mentioned, Paul, the launch site characteristics. If it's muddy, you know, can I even put a vehicle there, or they got to find? Do I have to lay some gravel down to prepare the launch site? And if I do have to do that, that's in the tactical environment. Well, how easy is it for me to put gravel down? And so you get these kind of nuts and bolts, you know, engineering problems that are in front of you that you have to deal with. So the Navy craft are delivered by November, and they're going to start training, you know, by the Meuse River. And again, they're going to start putting engineering tables and diagrams together to kind of figure out how they can embark some of these engineering assets across the river. And on top of that, they got to establish a school. You think about this. In combat, we're going to pull some guys off the line, and we're going to start teach them about movement and embarkation, team training for an amphibious assault, just like we did in the UK before Normandy. Well, now we're doing it here on the continent itself for this cross-channel invasion. And they're going to, or excuse me, cross-river movement, and they're going to practice it at night. They're going to practice it at day. Learn how to get on, how to get off. You know, these guys have been fighting a land campaign. Well, now they're stuck doing something amphibious. And so they establish a school with those two individual infantry divisions. And you can see that they create schools at Roermond and Meyersack to help these guys learn how to operate these things. And so, again, it's one of those things you see innovation occurring. Also, what I found interesting in doing some of my research, that the naval vehicles were used largely for saltwater operations. They had to be converted to working in freshwater operations, which, again, I'm not an engineer or a mechanic, but they said they had significant problems converting some of the engines over to handle this different environment. One of the things that they had to deal with was the cold weather, and they started wrapping blankets around some of the outboard motors to keep them warm, because I guess the cold was getting to the cylinders themselves. Again, I'm not an engineer, just reading the after action report that these guys had to come up with some newfangled applications to keep their equipment running properly. So we're getting close here to D-Day, and most of you know about Operation Varsity. I won't go into the detail of that. I'm sure it's been covered well by your other guests. With, you got 3,000 aircraft and gliders, 20,000 troops, 18th Airborne Corps, largest airborne operation, you know, of the war. But what you also see going on here is the night before, you're going to have an artillery barrage of both Brits and the U.S. that are prepping the battlefield. And we saw this occur in Normandy as they sent, you know, battleships and destroyers and the Army Air Corps, where they're pelting targets ashore. Same thing here. It's just on the far shore as opposed to a beach line itself. And you can see the numbers there that I put out at what they've shot out. They've also, we talked about this a little bit before, Paul, as you mentioned, they got a stockpile about 138,000 tons of supplies and equipment somewhere east of the Rhine, because they got to move that stuff forward. So again, when you think about traffic management, where are you going to park these things, all this gear? How are you going to get it to your launching sites and do it in a sequenced event so it is there on H hour, on D-Day, ready to go. That takes some very detailed planning. And you're going to have 22,000 U.S. engineers alone in this operation. How do you maintain, how do you manage the sea of manpower and get these guys to work towards one?
It's going to be kind of like a big, complicated Pony Express type thing, isn't it? Where you kind of move things on and then hand over to another rider or another army with more fuel to push on for that, because as you said, this stuff is coming a long way. The majority of it has come from the US. It's then either come directly into France or from the UK, all the way across Europe through several countries. You're burning gas the entire time. You're wearing down engines the entire time. And yet they're able to do this extraordinary effort and bring that amount of stuff up. If the German commanders could see this logistical operation, they would have thrown their hat in before the Allies got anywhere near the banks of the Rhine.
I agree with you. I think what I think is more amazing for me, Paul, is that both of our armies are the Allied army. They're amateurs, by and large. We didn't have large standing armies before the war. You didn't. We didn't. These are amateurs who are learning their craft.
Yeah.
In the forge of battle, to wax poetically. But the thing is, they're thinking and they're learning really quick. And to your point, the Germans don't do this ever. They got their armored fist that's going to punch through with blitzkrieg, but then that tail and as I'm sure you've discussed, on the Eastern Front, they don't have that log tail. They don't think about it. No. Or if they have, the execution falls far short. Because the tyranny of distance and cube. And so, to your point, again, I can't underscore how complex this is, and it can get into the boring, but
logistics are never boring. We've got a great audience of World War II TV people. We've trained them well over the years. They love their logistics.
Again, and fortunately for us at this time, the Rhine's at a 10-year low. The velocity is only 5 to 8 feet per second, but that's kind of where we're at with the final preparations here as we get ready for the crossing. So here I've got the 16 Corps area of operations. As you can see, I got the 79th Division over here, and here's the 30th Division right here. Here's your red beach. Here is your white beach. I put it in gray because white wouldn't show up. And here's your blue beach right here. The Schwalach, Meram, and Milchplatz will be the three basic locations you're going to see the bulk of the bridging operations occur. So the 79th ID, which is in the southern part of the map I just showed you, they're supposed to construct a Class 40 M2 treadway bridge, which means it can move tanks. When you say Class 40, it means it can move tanks in the vicinity of Milchplatz. And what's going to happen, the division is going to attack on the right flank of the Corps frontage. There's an arty prep from 2 to 3 in the morning. And during that time, the units will move to their crossing sites there under artillery coverage. And HR will be at 03. So that arty prep will end. It will shift over to the 30th ID area at 03. But the first prep is going to happen from 2 to 3. 2 battalions in the assault at 3 waves, moving at 15-minute intervals. The first wave is going to cross up with 28 boats, followed by 2 more assault boats. And then the LCMs and the LCVPs and the ducks are going to start moving assets across the river. And here's a graphic representation of, you can see where I have that dashed line. This is where the treadway bridge is going to be put in place. This is done after the fact to give you kind of the lay down. Here's Milchplatz right here. And you can see here, there's a number of sites where they're going to put some of the craft, either park them or use these as ferry sites to move stuff across the river itself. Now, one of the problems they have is when they get to the first wave gets to the crossing site, there's some pretty steep banks. And a couple of boats don't make it ashore. But the personnel are able to swim ashore, again, trying to navigate the river itself. Second wave lands, as does the third. And what they're going to do is they're going to mark the boundaries of their bridgehead with signal lights. So the follow-on waves know where the bridgehead is. So that way they don't, land somewhere far down the river itself. So again, it's important to identify where the landing zone is. And by 06, you have 1 regiment across, and the entire division is across by basically 2 that afternoon. So it's a pretty efficient movement of moving that entire division across. You're also going to have those LTVs, those tracked vehicles, are starting to ferry equipment across basically an hour later. And they're going to make 107 trips back and forth on D-Day alone, moving equipment, men, and materials. And as you see here, they're going to start immediately constructing that 1,200-foot treadway bridge. They're going to start that thing. And they're going to, one of the problems they have is that they start it, and then a runaway LCM runs into the bridge because they're kind of hard to operate in the river. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. And you have some enemy arty that comes in and delays, the completion of the bridge, but it's finished by 1800 on the 26th. The 30th Division is working with the 1153rd Engineer Combat Group, and they're going to construct an M2 Class 40 bridge and a heavy pontoon bridge around Wallach, an M1 bridge in Mirham, and put up some protective debris booms. I didn't talk about this before, but it's important because think about what's floating in a river, and this is wartime, and you can have all kinds of debris that's floating in these things, and if it hits the bridge, it can cause some serious damage to the bridge, or if the Germans put a mine down there or something like that. Because think about wartime, everything is being thrown all around. There's a lot of trash in there. So it's important to put these bridges, these booms in there to protect the bridges. These guys are going to move an hour earlier from 02. The RD prep is an hour before. They're going to get to their line of departure during that. And they're going to use 3 battalions with others in trace, 150 craft in the first wave. They're going to cross in 4 waves in 2-minute intervals. So again, very much like an amphibious assault that you saw, in the landing. And again, here's the layout. Again, I mentioned these names. Here's Milchplatz we talked about here, where they're going to put that bridge. Here's Meram, and here's Wallach right here. So the 30th Division Corps and the 70th Division Corps. Maps are always important because people got to know where the hell is that place.
Yeah.
So you can see here the 30th ID, their initial wave, followed by the M2 boats. They don't have a lot of opposition. Okay, but they're going to put some of the supporting weapons in those landing craft and the ferries. The infantry is across by 6. The Amtraks are in use just shortly afterwards. And the first LCMs launched by 9 that morning. Again, this is happening relatively quickly. And by 12 o'clock that day, the engineers have built 2 Bailey rafts, and several treadway rafts have already been built. And the armor is beginning to cross. After they get some of these bridges built, you're also going to start moving your Class 4 and your Class 5, i.e. your engineering assets, Class 4 and Class 5, your ammunition that you need to continue the fight. Because remember, this is a passage of lines. They're only establishing the bridgehead, and those other corps are going to come through and do subsequent operations past the bridgeheads themselves. Okay. You can see here when the Wallach Bridge starts to be constructed at 6:30, it's operational that afternoon. And in the following weeks, they're going to make some treadway bridge, some heavy pontoon bridges, and some Bailey bridges. So just like with every defensive position, you continue to improve what you have available to you. So we're going to have more bridges. Why? Because more places to cross means I can get more gear to that far side. And you can see here what I'm talking about with regards to that passage of line on far shore operations. And so you're going to land on that far shore there at Wallach, and then you're going to pass those other battalions through as they push up toward the Lippe-Sentin Canal and for subsequent operations ashore. Up in the 30th Division Air, they're going to establish a highway bridge. Okay, the 3rd Army has one at various locations at Oppenheim and Mainz. The 9th Army is going to establish one near Wesel, and it's going to be at the meeting point of the Lippe and Rhine rivers. It's going to be a Class 70 bridge. It takes them about 18 days to construct this thing, 1,800 feet, and it's going to have to also span across the Lippe. So you have a total of 4,000 feet with the approaches. When I say the approach, you just can't lay a bridge down. It's got to have gravel that gets you to the road, to the bridge, so you can cross over. So that means preparing on the far side and the near side, so the vehicles can drive across that span. That's why it's 4,000 feet for the total foot of the bridge that's required. And the top picture here, you can see the new bridge as opposed to the old German railway bridge. And here is the completed bridge. And this is those caissons you have to build to allow vehicles to get to the bridge. You got to build that up with gravel and dirt so the vehicles can drive up upon the bridge itself. So again, an incredible engineering feat. So, 9th Army movement by D+17. Most of the 9th Army is already pushed across it. The vessel bridges are going to carry a lot of the traffic. And again, as we mentioned before, Paul, this idea of MPs, they got to control the flow. And you have what we'll refer to in the modern days as transportation credits. Who has authority to move across that bridge at what time? You'll have set windows. You can move your unit here from point A to point B. Don't be late because everybody else is waiting to use that bridge or that road. It requires that kind of coordination to manage these road assets and these bridge assets. Okay. The M2 tanks, they have to go at least, or the M26s have to go over at least a class 40 bridge. Thing is, they're way too heavy for a class 40, but if you move them very slowly, they can work. And you see a picture here of one of those actually doing it. So they're outweighing the bridge here, but if they're real careful, they can get those across, and they do here. And proof's in the pudding in this picture.
Brilliant stuff.
And here's basically the expansion of the bridgehead. Why do we do this thing? You can see in the circles, I have Wesel, Wallach, and Milchplatt. And you can see the 30th and the 79th Division pushing inland towards the Ruhr Valley proper. Here is your core objectives right here. And our British counterparts are up here pushing along the northern edge of the Lippe River. So again, all that is happening just so it can get into the Ruhr Valley and conduct subsequent operations, at least on the far side, or I would say subsequent operations ashore. So as they, kind of do the after action review, they found that the LCVPs are excellent riverine platforms, but as we talked about earlier, Paul, you need better launching techniques depending on what the river edge has for you and if you have engineering assets available to you. The LCMs were too big. They found and ungainly in the swift river. So while we wanted to use those to move, the tanks across, it got to be problematic. They're using them because they were just very difficult to handle. The sea mules, same problem. They had a 6-foot draft, so getting them, to actual float near the shoreline was problematic, and they too were rather difficult to control in the river's swift current. The treadway bridges, prefabrication and construction was outstanding. As a matter of fact, what they tried to do is construct as much of the bridge as they could in a secure area and then move it to the launching site. That way you're not exposed to enemy fire putting this whole thing together. And so it required, some planning as to, hey, how much can I actually complete this asset before, and can I still move it to get it to a crossing site? And the M1 bridges weren't as efficient, and beach marking and boundaries were key for organizing the crossing. And we talked about that last week with beachhead organization, command and control, and logistics. And we found here's our favorite Brit, Winston Churchill, crossing there near Rheinberg, or Murham is where he crosses the Rhine River. And he says something to the effect of, after we cross the river, the German is done, or something like that. He kind of he smells the barn as well. To your point, Paul, why we fast forward to May 8th with not really looking at what's going on between, say, the Bulge and the surrender of Germany proper. So I will stop talking.
As always, masterclass. Dr. John, fantastic stuff. And there's a couple of comments early on. November, they are bringing landing craft. This is a safe planning machine getting ready for the Rhine while they're still on the Siegfried line. I mean, it's, as you said it, this is being planned as far ahead in some ways as like Overlord was, just months ahead. They haven't even got anywhere near Germany, but of course, they've got to look at one map of Europe, and you see, as you said there, the Rhine running sort of north-south down there. They've got to do it, so they might as well plan for it. And then Terry Down said just a few minutes ago, by this time, the Allies are performing engineering miracles practically as a matter of routine. And I think that's it. It's so impressive, and it almost isn't impressive because it's because it looks like it's like a magician, isn't it? It's being done so well. You don't even see the amazing trick that's being
It's
performed.
like a matter of fact. Yeah, we can do this. And again, this speaks to the learning that the Allies do in the heat of battle. They figure things out, and so you get this idea of how innovation takes hold and how important it is, especially in a modern mechanized military where, hey, there's going to be action, counteraction, counteraction. How do you develop a counter to an enemy development? And sometimes your enemy is internal. How do I move this bulk of men and material? That's my own enemy. Is the tyranny of cube and distance. And this is something that the Allies excel in.
Yeah, and absolutely. I just want to, before we end things, as you are, in my opinion, kind of first and foremost an air power guy as well in terms of your writing and your expertise. In terms of the ground, air support for the crossing of the Rhine and Varsity, it seems that maybe it wasn't quite as well done as the ground elements. I mean, is that fair? I mean, the flak was an issue for the Varsity, and what is the state of air support for all of it?
I failed to really mention how much the RAF and the U.S. Army Air Forces are conducting BAI out there prior to D-Day here, the battlefield air interdiction. And they are dropping, I forget the number off the top of my head is, but I think it's like 35,000 tons of ordnance on the far side of the Rhine in prep for this operation. And there are some, flak challenges, and there are, a few fighters that come in. I think I read a report where that one comes in like right after D-Day and that they shoot it down. But what you're seeing by this stage, the Air Corps has established air superiority. And so that umbrella exists. Doesn't mean that there isn't going to be a couple of planes shot down, and there won't be, because the enemy gets a vote. There's always going to be that. But what you're seeing here is the Army Air Corps in direct support, and the Royal Air Force in direct support of ground units. And we're figuring this stuff out, just like we did working with the Navy for an assault. We're figuring out how do we get the Air Force involved in this, and they're doing it. And the 9th Air Force, is just gangbusters, with their ability with P-47s, rolling in and providing that umbrella for the ship-to-shore movement on this, or the shore-to-shore movement, excuse me, on this one. And I didn't emphasize that enough on what they're doing pre-D-Day to shape the battlefield before they cross the river.
Another thing I want to ask you about, I think I've spoken to this about John McManus and others, and Kevin, I think as well, is that from Normandy particularly, but you see it earlier in Italy as well, the Americans, although the British as well, the Americans have particularly got good at just laying a lot of rounds on target. You see the anti-aircraft units using their half track to support river crossings. You see tank destroyers, tanks, everything being used to just lay stuff across, even though it's got a specific use. You see it being used in this sort of support. Is that something? Again, the Allies have all these toys in the toolbox. You may as well use them. But is that something you saw there, that they can just bring a huge amount of firepower to bear from all different types of sources?
Yeah, and it's the maximum use of available resources. I don't care what it was designed to do. What can it do? You saw like Apollo 13, and they had to make that comment. It's the same thing. What can I do with this? Even though it was designed to do X, can I use it for Y? And what you're seeing here is this ability to innovate with these available resources. And you mentioned firepower. Do the Allies have it? You bet we do. But I think what's more important is the manner in which we use it. And the fact that we're coordinating it and we're planning it out in detail. It doesn't mean things don't go wrong. It doesn't mean, that it goes 100%. But you see this detailed planning. You see detailed coordination between armor, infantry, air, all working together basically off the same sheet of music. And you're right, things are going to go wrong. But they're developing operational and tactical competence throughout this campaign at levels no other armies, plural, could do that like the Americans and the Brits do. We all have our arguments between grand strategy, but between the two armies, nobody can do it like the Brits and the Americans are doing it here in 1945. And I think that's kind of a testament to these soldiers and the fact that, again, they're amateurs in 1941. The Brits aren't. The Brits are in this war obviously since 39, but they're learning quickly. And it speaks to the intellectual firepower of those officers and men to come up with new ideas and new methodologies to get to the objective.
I mean, the US, British, and Canadian armies had reinvented themselves a dozen times from 1939, 40, 41 on to 45, just like a kind of a snake shedding its skin and becoming a bigger and better snake all the way through. A snake's a weird analogy there, but that there is this incredible learning curve, and you know, and I get so frustrated with why did the Allies take so long to get from Normandy to be? I mean, are you kidding me?
Are you kidding me? Yeah, you're moving,
remove an occupying army from all those countries, and I mean, it's nonsense. The Allies move like lightning.
And to the same token, you have a responsibility of those liberated peoples.
Yeah,
you gotta secure them. You have a requirement. You just don't walk by and, now you have, governmental instance agencies are going to be stood up, AMGOTs and those kinds of things. But when you think about the requirement, not only for combat operations first, but sustainment operations, and you have locals that are going to need, support. You have to manage that. You have to govern it now, and that's a draw on resources. Because you have to do this. And so again, these are the kind of the non-sexy things that we should be discussing. Why this is so difficult, why this requires detailed planning, why it requires so much weight and so much cube, and the fact that the Allies have to power project this not only from the United States but also from Great Britain. From ports there in the UK across the English Channel, and then to Le Havre or into other ports there in Europe. That takes a significant amount of capital.
Brilliant stuff. So another comment, well, it's an offer really. Wesel Aviation says, I have a copy of the Crossing the Rhine with the 16th Corps Engineers if Dr. Curatola or the World War II Museum would like it. So I don't know whether you've got that book or seen it.
Yeah, we do.
You've got that one.
Thank you for the offer, sir.
And then Ian Carr said, had bridge erection training been done across the Seine or Moselle or similar? So, you talked about these schools and that. Where, I mean, you don't find a river like the Rhine everywhere. The Rhine is a particularly impressive beast. I mean, but was there a particular river they'd used earlier in the campaign?
For armies, training is incessant. You have to maintain your competency, you have to maintain your skill sets, and so you did see this kind of, this unit may not be in combat. Those guys just don't sit around waiting for something to happen. You got to keep them busy. You got to keep them sharp. And even units that were habitually in combat, when they were pulled off the line, they're back in the training cycle in some way, shape, or form, whether it's marksmanship, first aid, those kinds of things. And so to answer your question, yes, especially with engineers, which is a technical skill, so you're going to see, these guys having to keep themselves sharp in terms of their skill sets. And again, whatever challenges they may have in a local area that may be an obstacle to them erecting a bridge, or whatever the case may be. So to answer your question, yes, they're constantly training for this stuff.
And my kind of last comment really is, and you're a fellow Normandy aficionado like myself, is that the 30th and the 79th there, who are very much not there in the first few days in Normandy. They arrive in within weeks to follow, and considered maybe always bridesmaids rather than brides. And we have this obsession as the public with D-Day veterans, and he was first wave on June the 6th. Well, these guys who weren't first wave in Normandy, but 79th battled their way up to Cherbourg and then back down again. The 30th, all those problems they had pushing around Saint-Lô and across the Vire River and that kind of stuff. But there they are across the Rhine, the lower Rhine there, paving their way into Germany proper. And yet we don't consider those sorts of veterans in the same way as we would consider a D-Day veteran. And it's our failing.
Yeah,
we've put, not that I'm saying that the people who did D-Day weren't brilliant, because of course they were, but we've put that on a different kind of pedestal to these guys who are doing something just as important. And as you said, it's another D-Day.
Yeah, and to your point, nobody wrote a Pulitzer or a best-selling book on the 30th Infantry Division. It's good for the 101st. It helps when you have a talented author who writes who can write well and write a book about it that everybody buys. But as you like, there's literally dozens of divisions out there that are doing yeoman work that is not sexy, that is largely overlooked. And as you well know, Paul, that's where the fun is.
Yeah,
Is
absolutely.
finding these little gems that nobody really knows about. And you get into, say, and many of you, that they have their division histories have been published, by, internal organizations. And there are just jewels in there of photographs and accounts and,
I have the 30th and the 79th books, and they're great, aren't they? Yeah, they're fantastic.
You find so much stuff in there that provide context, that gives you personalities. It kind of shows you what the guys were thinking, as opposed to reading the green books, you know what I mean, or official after action reports. Because in the green books, everybody gets along, everybody's above average, right? But you get into some of the division histories, and you get some more of the gritty detail. That's really where the fun is.
The green books are like a map of a city without the landmarks in it. It will get you from A to B. It'll tell you this is where they started. They went via this, via this, via this. But to me, the divisional histories are like, here's the good nightclub. Don't get stuck on this junction there, because that's whether it's that detail you need about the journey, as opposed to the green books are invaluable. They explain the journey, but they don't explain the thinking behind the journey.
And I think, to your point, they expose the human element of war.
Yeah.
And to wax about Clausewitz, war is a human endeavor subject to human frailties, and those capture that. So I would encourage your readers to seek those out, at secondhand book sales and eBay and those kinds of things, because they are just wonderful little gems. And you can, as you pointed out, bring out some of the details that you wouldn't see in the official histories.
Yeah. Well, John, it's been fantastic talking to you, folks. We've got 2 shows tomorrow. Christopher Jarry is talking about the 140 Brigade, part of 30 Corps, pushing their way into Germany. Then in the evening or afternoon in the USA, Jack Bousher is on talking about what he believes is the greatest combined arms operation of World War II, which, hint, hint, took place in Burma. Burma into India. We'll find all about tomorrow. But in the meantime, don't forget to click like and subscribe. The link to Dr. John's book is in the description below, or find it at your local favorite bookstore. But in the meantime, I'm just going to say thank you very much for watching. I will see you all again 2 shows tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Cheers. Thanks, Paul.